I'm Cody Horton. I want to welcome you all to the webinar that we have today. We've got a good friend of mine, Tarsha McMormick, and I really feel fortunate that Tarsha is actually joining us today because she has a very busy schedule as the head of D&I. I'll let her talk a little bit about her background, but Tasha, it's an honor to have you here with us to share a lot of your insight and wisdom. And I just wanted to toss it over to you and let you talk a little bit about your background.
Thank you for having me, Cody. And you know, I'm doing this just because it's you. But I am always happy and excited to talk about diversity and inclusion. So I was happy to hear that you were doing a webinar on this topic. So again, I'm Tarsha McMormick. I am the head of diversity and inclusion for ThoughtWorks. We are a global IT consulting company, and I've been with them for I think close to 22 years now. You know, I can't track all of the time, but I have been in the people space that entire time, from recruiting to HR manager, benefits manager, HR business partner. For the last 5 or 6 years now, I've focused on diversity and inclusion.
Well, that's just amazing. I know you've got some phenomenal work that you've done. I think back to when we worked together and some of the challenges that we worked through and some of the issues that we worked through. I'm Cody Horton, Managing Director for Diverse Recruiting Experts. We help companies find diverse sales leaders and hire them. I've been doing this work for a couple of decades now, and I'm really thrilled to have Tarsha share her insight with you. Tarsha, you know, I know some of the things we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about just getting beyond the public statement. I know you're going to share some things that leaders can do to take it to the next level. I believe you're going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and how that's impacting people. And then ultimately, we want to have people walk away knowing what's their individual responsibility and what things can they do. And we'll talk a little bit about just the impact of training, right? Because you hear everybody say, hey, let's do the training, and then how that training is impacting your workforce. But I wanted to start by just setting the stage, Tarsha, and because we're going to hear all kinds of language, and just have you give us a level set on some of the terms that people can expect to hear as they start and continue their D&I journeys.
Okay, sounds great. And I know that may sound a bit rudimentary for some, but there are a lot of people out there who are really just starting to pay more attention to diversity and inclusion. And so some of the terminology may be a little foreign to them. You know, they may have heard the term, but not exactly sure how that applies to the workplace. So that's a great starting point. So let's talk a little bit about diversity. So diversity is just the basic numbers, you know, of your workforce. If you think about the different social identities that people have, some of the more popular ones are race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation and identity, marital status. But diversity also includes, you know, culture, your geographical location, your socioeconomic status, education, veteran status. All of those are different social identities that make up diversity. Now, when we talk about inclusion, inclusion is the conscious choice that we make to consider all of the social identities in the workforce. So let's use an example of dietary needs. If every month you hold a staff meeting and you don't consider people who may be vegetarian or vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free, or in my case, gluten and dairy-free, then you aren't really being inclusive. So there are two ways to do that. Either you can proactively order meals that everyone can eat, or you ask people, do you have any dietary restrictions? And then you order a special meal for them. So that's what inclusion looks like. And then you hear a lot of people talking about belonging now as well. And that's really when your employees feel like they're valued, they're heard, they're supported. And when you proactively do things to include them and create an inclusive environment, that's when your employees feel that sense of belonging.
Yeah, no, that is I mean, I really appreciate you doing that level set. Certainly, we did a previous webinar where we talked about racism and bias and all those things. And so I think while some people may think it's the basics, you need to have that common understanding of what we're talking about, just because words matter and the meaning of words matter. So I really appreciate you sharing that. One of the things, I was having a conversation with someone and they're just exhausted, right? They said there's so much going on with COVID-19, with the civil unrest that's out there, the economic challenges that people are talking about, and also a political year. People are a bit overwhelmed, and it almost seems like we really do have a mental health crisis. What would you advise people to do to help them work through these scenarios with their employees?
That is a great question. And you said a lot. 2020 has been, relenting in so many ways, right? For everything you mentioned. And let's not forget the murder hornets, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yes.
but healthcare plans have seen a huge uptick in the number of prescriptions that have been written for both depression and anxiety medication. And anecdotally, companies knew that all of these things were impacting their employees, but that really helped to confirm it. So some of the things that we've done, and I'll go back and just say, it has affected all of us, but we all are dealing with it in different ways. So some of the things that we've done at ThoughtWorks is we've tried to set the tone that it's okay to not be okay. We started a Wellness Wednesdays program where every Wednesday for an hour, we talk about a different wellness related topic. We've done stuff on our employee assistance program, mindfulness, financial well-being, your career well-being. We started a walking and step challenge. We've done yoga. We even did Pets on Parade last Wednesday.
Wow.
We created a program for employees to donate vacation time to, other employees who may have to deal with COVID, who are impacted by child and elder care because of issues related to COVID. We've allowed our employees to work a flexible work schedule as much as possible. We've encouraged the use of vacation time or taking a leave of absence. There were also some ways that the government allowed employers to help their employees with making changes to their medical plan in the middle of the year or making changes to their flexible spending accounts. So we allowed all of that. Communication has also been important. We started a weekly communication from our managing director that talks about the state of the business. And every Friday, we have a town hall meeting, and we allow employees to post questions and participate on that every Friday. So those are just a few ways that we've been able to do that. And we also thought it was important to have candid conversations with our leaders about what are they doing to deal with anxiety and stress. And so that's definitely one thing overall. But then we also have to think about 2020 hasn't impacted everyone the same way. If we look at the Black and Brown communities, I think there's been a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 because you typically see more Black and Brown people in essential roles. Um, we've had to memorialize more of our loved ones, via Zoom because you couldn't funeralize them in the normal way. Then you add in the civil unrest. And again, these are things that obviously impact everyone. But for every viral video that you see, there are countless number that don't make it to prime time, and we are absorbing that every day. And so, organizations have to realize that their employees may not be okay. And we need to look for ways to be able to address uh, address racism. We have to look for ways to be able to better support our employees, and just be mindful that people may not always be there in those meetings on the Zoom calls, and be a little more empathetic.
Yeah, it's you listed some great things to cover. I really think that the listeners should really go back and kind of look at some of the things you covered, because you covered a lot of things that may help us work through all the different scenarios, right? The two big glaring ones are certainly the COVID-19 impact, and then all the unrest around, all the civil unrest that's taking place, and people just aren't knowing how to cope with that. Managers are also having to step up their game, and they may not be prepared to do that, and they just may not know what to do, because leaders are people too, and they get tired, and they don't want to take a step. You mentioned ThoughtWorks, and I remember one of our first meetings together. You and I were meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, at the site where Michael Brown was shot and killed by the police. That seems like eons ago, but that same backdrop still exists today. And what's encouraging is a lot of organizations have come out and they've taken a stand. They've made a statement saying that they are advocating and supporting. But now, what do those leaders do? I mean, what do the organizations do beyond just making that public statement against racism? Do you have any insight into what people can do to go forward and take that next step?
I do, and I'm so happy you asked that question, because there were so many companies making a public statement. But now I think about what happens after that, right? Now it's time for you to actually put your money where your mouth is. And that's going to look very different for each organization. And it really depends on where they are at in their diversity and inclusion journey. I'll tell you what we did at ThoughtWorks, and then offer some suggestions. I like to call it the week that the world was on fire. So that weekend, I sent an email to our leadership team, just sharing a bit more about my feelings about what was happening. That I was heartbroken, that I realized that we needed to address the situation. And it was a way for me to, in many ways, vent and share, so that I could be in a position to be able to support our employees that next day. So that Monday, we simply gave space to our employees who identified as Black. We gave them the space to come together, to connect, to support, to cry, to vent. And then we had a company-wide session where we did the same thing. And we probably had close to 120 employees join. And it was very cathartic in many ways to hear from people. We did the same thing that Tuesday. On Wednesday, we had a representative from our employee assistance program come out and lead a session, because we recognize that people may need some additional support, whether that was counseling or other support. And then that Thursday, we got together and we did a group brainstorming session about what are some things that we could do both individually and collectively as an organization to start to impact some positive social change. We've also had discussions about Juneteenth. So coming out of that brainstorming session, we formed a racial justice working group. And all of the ideas that were collected from that session, that group looked at them, they grouped them by themes. We sent out the information to our employees to vote on the top 2 or 3 things in each of those categories that we should start working on. And we're in the process of doing that work. One of the suggestions was an internship program that focused on Black and Brown students. So again, we're in the process of building the framework for that internship program. We have done a 15-day allyship challenge. We've completed a 15-day racial justice challenge. We're establishing relationships with historically Black colleges and universities. And so there's a lot that's going on. And I know that for every employer, particularly the smaller ones, you may not be able to do that. And so what you can do is make diversity and inclusion a priority. Whatever you do, be authentic, be transparent, be vulnerable. Tell your employees you don't have all of the answers. But guess what? No one does. It's fine to say that we could probably do better as an organization. ThoughtWorks could do better as an organization. I think all organizations can do better, but be committed to figuring out how you can improve things within your organization. And then you have to commit to being there for the long haul. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, but really unlike a marathon, there isn't a finish line. There is no end state. It's ongoing. You can only continue to get better. And then either hire a D&I consultant, hire a head of diversity and inclusion, or have someone within your organization focus on D&I. Because without that, without the intent, you probably aren't going to obtain any long-term success and meet any of your goals. And then, don't remain silent. Employees, candidates, customers, clients, they are all paying attention. They're all asking about, what are your diversity and inclusion efforts? What are you doing in this space? And you have to be prepared. In fact, McKinsey released a study a couple of weeks ago that said when candidates perceive a lack of inclusion, they are walking away from job offers right now. So 50% of the candidates who identify as LGBTQ+, I think it was 45% who identified as a race or ethnic minority, and 39% overall walked away just because of the lack of perceived inclusion. So this stuff is really important.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. Even when a job description, you may not even get to interview a candidate, because if they read your job description and it's not inclusive, people will opt out of even applying to the job because they don't think, hey, I'll never meet those requirements. And so I think having a focus on that inclusion part is so critical. I want to take a second here and just look to see if there are any questions in the chat. So I've got a question. This is came in anonymously. It says, my friends are tired of hearing me talk about racism, but they're not doing anything about it. What advice do you have, and how should I address this topic, or should I just drop it?
Wow, we're starting with the heavy hitters, right? Well, you know what? I get it. I'm tired as well. And I wish there wasn't a need for us to discuss it, but we know that isn't reality, right? And so I would encourage you to continue to press ahead and have those conversations, because we all have a role to play in ending racism, and it starts with having that conversation, and some ways to start that conversation. We've all heard is, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So have you ever considered, this perspective? Can I offer you a different perspective? Are you open to listening to my experience? Are you open to listening to what I've learned? Let me share what I've learned. Ultimately, we may not be able to change a person's opinion, but I'm hopeful that if we continue to have these discussions, that it will eventually move us closer to some type of shared understanding. Maybe we will help to open people's minds a bit more. Maybe they will become a bit more empathetic, once they hear about your lived experience. And we all just have to keep in mind, just because it isn't our lived experience doesn't mean that it invalidates another person's experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's great information. We've got another question here from Janice. It said, how do I start the conversation with my employer if they don't have a formal committee or a role to address diversity and inclusion?
So, great question. I would I would have a conversation and say, hey, this is extremely important right now. Other employers are starting to give more thought to formal diversity and inclusion programs. Here are the benefits of doing that. There's a business case for it, and there's tons of information out there that speaks to why diverse and inclusive environments work better. If your employer wants the business case, you can go that route. But there's also, it's just the right thing to do. And the employees are demanding it, the customers are demanding it, clients are demanding it. And if you have the support of other employees within your organization, I'm sure they'll start to listen. You can even start with employee resource groups.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about some of the research that was out there, how people are losing out on diverse candidates in their roles. If I'm the person, a lot of our audience are heads of TA, HR professionals, diversity and inclusion people. If we're just trying to get started, what are some other ways to get that company involved and get them moving forward on setting the foundation, at least to address some of the issues around inclusion, diversity, racism?
So are you asking specifically from a recruiting perspective, or just at the organizational level?
I'm thinking at the organizational level, because the goal is for them to be able to impact the organization. And so what would you advise there?
Okay. So you have to be intentional. I always believe that you need to start with an assessment of your organization, do a holistic assessment from beginning to end of your benefits, your policies, your practices, to see if there are any gaps, if there are any places that you need to make enhancements, to see where you can mitigate bias in your process. Once you do that, create a plan. A plan is extremely important because one, it is going to direct the work that you're planning to do. But we also know good intentions don't always yield results. Plans don't always yield results, but you have a better chance of being effective with the plan. You want to be more proactive when it comes to diversity and inclusion. You don't want to be reactive. Also engage your employees. Your employees are a good source of information. They have the pulse on what's going on. It can't be a plan where it's top down. It can't just be bottom up, because you need the support. And it's also great to have your employees help lead some of the work. And then you need to consider those key areas again, like how and where you're recruiting, how are you retaining and supporting your employees? Are you looking at, again, unconscious bias in your recruiting process? Do you have diverse interview panels? Are you looking to, I shouldn't say looking, but do you have, and I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit tongue-tied here. Do you do candidate debriefs afterwards? To look for ways to help mitigate that bias. Again, what are the benefits like? Are there benefits that you should have in place that would attract more diverse employees? And then training and awareness. Start having those tough conversations. It's not easy. Talk about unconscious bias, talk about intersectionality, privilege, allyship. All of those things matter, and they start to lay the foundation and help you create the culture and the workforce environment that you're looking for.
Yeah. One of the things you made me think about, so a lot of the inquiries that I'm getting and seeing now is, hey, do you have training for this, right? And will training help us? I think the question is training the way it exists today enough? Does implicit bias training get us where we want to go? What needs to change about the D&I training to really have an impact? And will unconscious bias even fix this issue?
So no, unconscious bias isn't going to fix it. Training is great. However, it can't be the one and only thing that you do. You can't do training just to check the box to say that we did an unconscious bias training, or we rolled out some other D&I related training. Training is one piece of a much larger puzzle. It's part of your strategic plan. And so until you have all of those pieces in place, you probably aren't going to, again, see that long-term success that you're looking for.
Okay, yeah, that makes, because there's a huge need for and a huge demand for that training and that unconscious bias training. When I think about some of the other things, like what can organizations do to have that impactful change, and what might they expect for results, right? They're going to talk about training, but are there other things that they can do to really start to see an impact when it comes to diverse hiring and inclusion, and eliminating some of the things that might be based in the racism?
So other things that they can expect, our employees wanted to engage more with us. They wanted to have more employee resource groups. Our employee resource groups are fairly new. We started our Black at ThoughtWorks resource group maybe about 10 years ago, but we really didn't have another one formed until about 2 years ago. So now we have 5. We have women, we have a Latinx group, we have a caregivers group, and we have the LGBTQ plus group. We've also created D&I and engagement surveys, and that has been one of the most strategic things I think we could have done as an organization, because it gave us a lot of insight and feedback into areas that we hadn't thought about, but also it helps provide us the blueprint, so to speak, of the things that we need to tackle as an organization and what we need to put into place. So those are the types of things that you'll start to see as you start to go down your D&I journey and engage more with your employees about what they're looking for and what they need.
Great. I'm looking, I see a question here. So Rolanda has a question. I don't want to make this about political points of view, but why does it seem that people with more liberal backgrounds appear to be more focused on addressing racism than those with more conservative perspectives? Ooh, that's the hot one.
Okay, the questions. Okay.
Thank you, Rolanda.
Okay, Rolanda. So I don't think it's political. I think if we look at historical data, people of color, particularly Blacks or African American, have tended to identify more with the liberal viewpoints. And so it makes sense that this group is probably more focused on addressing racism, because this is the group that is is more negatively impacted by it.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a pretty hot one. When you think about it, it's just, it's who are you around and who are you sharing that information with, and what are their perspectives? I mean, a lot of times I think people are just unaware of the problems that may exist, because if you've never been a Black person, or let's take your case, if you've never been a Black woman, there are issues that you deal with every day that people don't know about. And so when they hear about it, they may just think, oh, well, that's not really a thing, right? They may not know it if they're not willing to kind of embrace the learning that's required to truly kind of understand a little bit more. And so I think that's a pretty hot button question.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in one of our trainings, in the intersectionality training, I take participants through an exercise where we talk about how might other people experience the workplace. So as a Black woman, I know how I experience it, right? But it probably differs for you as a Black man and me as a Black woman. Is going to be different for a white woman. You know, we're both women, but my experience is going to be different than that of a Black woman. I'm sorry, of a white woman. But also think about a cisgendered woman. Think about a transgendered woman. And so when we start to give thought to how people are experiencing the workplace and the lived experiences of others, I think it makes us more empathetic to understand those lived experiences, even though they aren't ours.
Yeah, no, great point. And so I've got a question for you, but I see a question here that I think you'll be able to answer in the context of the next question I'm going to ask you. So let me give you the question that's in the chat. Well, these are smoking hot. But these are real, right? We're not trying to sugarcoat anything here. So the question is, I know this is not about religion, but my white evangelical friends don't really buy into the fact that there is systemic racism. How do I educate them without offending them? And so that kind of fits into a little bit of this question I wanted to ask you is, how might people get comfortable with discussing racism and not sugarcoat?
Okay. Let's start with saying Google is your friend, right? There's a ton of information out there for anyone who wants to learn. Tons of data out there, and I'm not sure we can do this work and make everybody comfortable, right? I always say we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it's a very sensitive subject, and it will cause everyone to be reflective about their own life, their own journey, and think about how they have treated others, and give thought to things that they may want to do differently. And that's not always easy, and it's not always comfortable, but it's important to do that. And again, I go back to try to be compassionate when you have the conversation. Try not to be judgmental and attack the person, because that's going to shut down the conversation. But again, if you approach it from, can I offer you a different perspective? Let me share what I've learned. Have you given thought to this? When I looked up this data, here's what it says. And I'll offer the analogy that I heard a couple of months ago about monopoly, so people can understand systemic racism and that it still exists. If you and I play a game or a round of Monopoly, Cody, but the rules are different for me, okay? You get to purchase property, but I don't, okay? And so we finish the game, And at the end of the game, any money that I've collected from pass and go, I have to turn it over to you. And so now we play another round. You get to start out with all of the money from the previous game. I still am not allowed to purchase any property, any railroads. And at the end of that round, again, I have to turn over all of my money to you. So now imagine we play 400 games of Monopoly, and I still am not allowed to buy property. That's the equivalent of 400 plus years of slavery. Wow. So now that I'm able to purchase property, I can't purchase Boardwalk. I can't purchase Park Place. You know, I can only maybe purchase that purple property. What is it, Baltic?
Baltic Avenue or something down there. I know it's not Boardwalk or Park Place.
Right. Maybe I can purchase that, but it's still difficult for me to do that. And even if I have the money to purchase the Boardwalk and the Park Place, you won't allow me. You won't sell it to me, you know. And so, in addition to that, we have there's the discrimination with the housing. You know, we weren't allowed to vote. There were Jim Crow laws. You know, even Black men who went into the military, when they returned, they couldn't take advantage of the GI bills, you know, for education or for housing. And so that's how systemic racism happens. And then when we were finally able, again, to purchase and build our own communities, you think about what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 with the Tulsa race riots. They burned down the entire community. And that is systemic racism. And even today, you know, there's countless studies out there that say that people are discriminated against because of the sound of their name. If they have a quote unquote Black sounding name, there's studies out there that there's discrimination in housing when people try to rent apartments. And so it does happen. People may not have insight into it because it isn't their lived experience. But again, that doesn't mean that it's not valid and it isn't happening.
Yeah, you make some great points on things that we don't even think about, right? You might have learned it in a history class, or you probably didn't learn it in a history class, depending on where you went to school and what the curriculum was. And the things that you just hit on are things related to power and wealth and policy, and all those things combined, right? You know, wealth is typically inherited, right? You pass the wealth down from generation to generation. So if you didn't start with any wealth, I mean, to your Monopoly example, I think it's a great example. If you didn't start with wealth and there was nothing to pass down, you're always starting at ground zero every time you start. And so that's a perfect example of how if you were to share this with your friends who are not aware of it, and just give them that information, it might not change their mind, but it gives them another point of view to consider and more data to consider as they're trying to get past the emotional, because this is an emotional topic, right? So if you can get past the emotional engagement that people have and get them to look at the logical and the factual things, then people may find a way to say, you know what, that's not right. I was wrong. I'm willing to start to try to do something about this to a level. And so I really appreciate you sharing those key points. It makes a huge difference. So when we talk about racism, I mean, not everything is about racism, right? I mean, we hear a lot about it, but when you see things in your company that are going to have a strategic long-term impact, it's not all about racism, but what are some of the things that you can do in your company to really impact the ability to perform as a company and the ability to really take care of the people who work there?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Although racism or anti-racism is popular right now, it's not just about race and ethnicity. It is about creating a more diverse and inclusive organization as a whole. And so we have to figure out how we do that, how we allow our employees, as they say, to be their authentic selves, and create that workforce that is welcoming of everyone. It goes back to, and I know I keep saying it, but it goes back to having a strategic plan, and thinking about your framework, putting trainings in place that are addressing creating an inclusive environment for everyone, from allyship to unconscious bias to intersectionality, really looking at your benefits, to make sure, again, that they are attracting diverse candidates and employees, but also your policies. You know, do you have pay equity? You know, how are you promoting people? How are you supporting people? What does your leadership development programs look like? Are they diverse when you look at it from a gender, race, ethnicity, um, you know, sexual identity, orientation perspective? And so you really have to start to think about that. Um, do you talk about pronouns in the workplace? You know, and I don't want to say preferred pronouns, but are you educating employees about the use of pronouns? Stuff like the dietary needs of people. All of those things work to create that inclusive environment that you're trying to build.
No, it's great. And I know we're coming on. Let me look and see. We have another. So we have another question. One from Brooke here. Brooke says, "How do you sustain the energy and conversation on anti-racism once people get bored or feel better about what they've done to support the fight against racism?"
Yeah, it definitely can take an emotional toll on you because, again, it's emotional work, and because recent events like the civil unrest has brought, racism and anti-racism to the forefront. It isn't soup du jour, so to speak. So racism has been around, 400 plus years in the U.S. And just because it's in the spotlight right now doesn't mean that when it has quote unquote died down a bit that it goes away. It definitely doesn't go away for people who are impacted by it. And so the way that you sustain it is you look for ways to embed D&I in your culture of your organization. And you look for ways to make it business as usual. And this doesn't just relate to racism, but it relates to all aspects of diversity and inclusion. And you have to continue to work at it.
Yeah, it's interesting how that's a great question from Brooke. People's attention spans are pretty short, right? We get bored really fast, or we check the box and we move on. And so if I'm a person who was unaware of racism and I learned about George Floyd and some of the other things that have happened, and then I decide to put my money in a nonprofit that's focused on helping, Blacks or victims or whatever that is, I then feel like I've done what I'm supposed to do. And so I would challenge people to not let that check in the box of I gave my money or I posted a post on Facebook one time and now I'm done, I can move on, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things to that question that keeps the energy going. And I'd love to know if you had any other suggestions on how do you keep from letting yourself get off the hook, right? Like you gave yourself a pass, you gave your money, and so now I've given myself a pass, right? But if we keep it real, that's not going to matter because the problem is never going to go away, right? You hear people talk about, oh, it's like a marathon, but combating racism and discrimination and all those things, they're really not like a marathon because it never ends. It's a marathon that never ends. So how do you sustain that energy, right? I know you hit a few things on this, but any other things that you would suggest on that?
Yeah, definitely. Financial contributions are great, but to your point, um, there's so much more that can be done. You can volunteer, with some progressive organizations doing work, to make an impactful change. Things like saying, "Oh, I don't see color." Um, when you say that, what that tells me is that you don't see the injustice. You don't see what is happening. You've chosen not to see me and the impact that a lot of these things have on my life. Have the tough conversations with your friends and family and those in your circle, and start to to challenge them. About some of their beliefs, share what you've learned. And I always say silence supports the system. You can't be silent. When you're silent, it reinforces bad behaviors. It really reinforces stereotypes and injustice, and it gives cover for people to exhibit poor behavior. So challenge yourself to do a bit more and continue to educate yourself.
No, super. Well, I know we're close to time here. I'm just going to look to see if there are any questions in the chat. I don't see a question in the chat, but somebody sent me this question in email, and I want to make sure I told them that I would ask the question to you. What about making a mistake, right? People are afraid to take this challenge on and move forward with this conversation because they're worried about making a mistake. What would you tell people to do with regard to that?
So what I try to tell our employees in the environment we try to foster is that we're going to make mistakes, right? I think we've gotten hypersensitive in many ways as a society, that we don't allow people to learn and make mistakes. And that doesn't mean that the mistake isn't sometimes hurtful to people, but I try to give people the benefit of the doubt as much as possible. And I try to educate myself about those things that I'm not aware of. If you find that you make a mistake, apologize. Apologize and say, that wasn't my intention. Again, I apologize for any harm it has caused. I'm going to do better the next time. And I think if we all can be a little more compassionate, if we can all show a little more empathy and allow people the opportunity to learn and grow, we'll be better off.
Tarsha, I really think that's amazing. It's been great having you here. I wanted to get your kind of your parting thoughts on just things that people might do. If you take it from okay, I made a mistake, and it's always hard. Admit you made a mistake. It's all about change and transforming. What are some of the biggest things that a person can do to help them kind of transform themselves to become that person that is more of an anti-racist than a non-racist?
So I go back to education, and having an open mind and really listening to people, listening to their experience, and going from there. Those are the two big things for me.
Awesome. Yeah, that's for me too. Well, I really want to thank you for your time. It's an honor to have you here. I know how busy your schedule is, and I just appreciate you as a friend jumping in to help me, to help us and share your information with the team. And I really want to, encourage our audience to reach out if they've got anything. We'll make sure we have the replay ready to go. And I see a comment in here from Lori. It says, "This is a fantastic conversation. Love the questions too. Thank you. So valuable. I just sent both LinkedIn